Beneath the silver hush of evening, the city glowed in fragments of gold. Street lamps hummed against the quiet, their halos falling across the cobblestones like pools of memory. Among the crowds spilling out of cafes and glittering storefronts, a girl lingered in the shadowed corner of a small square. She clutched a worn satchel close to her chest, as though its fragile contents were the only anchor keeping her from drifting away. Her clothes carried the weary language of long days and longer nights, yet there was something in the way she held herself, an elegance hidden beneath the dust, a secret rhythm waiting to be discovered. She looked toward the wide glass windows of a grand restaurant where laughter rang like bells. Inside, men in tailored suits raised glasses of wine that gleamed like ruby fire, while women in silk gowns leaned close with eyes full of ease. Every movement behind that glass seemed painted with light, and every note of laughter reminded her of a world she had once belonged to, a world now drifting further beyond reach. The aroma of baked bread and roasted garlic slipped through the door each time it opened, and her empty stomach tightened. But more than the food, her eyes were drawn to the corner of the restaurant, where something old and quiet sat beneath a cascade of coats, a piano, its black surface dulled by years of silence. Her breath caught. In that moment, the hunger of her body gave way to the hunger of her soul. She remembered her father's voice, warm and healing, whispering that music was the language of the heart. The memory pressed into her chest with such force that her fingers twitched, aching for the keys. She could almost hear the first notes blooming in the air like morning birdsong, carrying with them the power to soften even the hardest heart. The world outside the window grew blurred, not with tears, but with longing. She stepped closer, her reflection trembling against the glass. Around her, footsteps passed without pause. No one noticed the girl who carried the remnants of a dream in her bag. Yet, within her silence, something stirred, a flame refusing to be smothered. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, as if the distance between her and that forgotten piano was only an illusion, as if she could slip through and bring it back to life. A gust of wind tugged at her hair, and for a moment it felt like the night itself was urging her forward. She straightened, pulling her shoulders back. Fear and courage collided inside her, but it was courage that won. With one steady breath, she pushed open the door and stepped into the light. The warmth of the restaurant wrapped around her like a memory of home, and every eye turned toward her. The brightness revealed the stains on her shirt, the tape across her worn shoes, and the exhaustion etched into her face. Conversations faltered, replaced by whispers that cut like knives. Yet she stood tall, her heart beating with the rhythm of something unbreakable. A manager approached, his voice sharp, dismissive, already commanding her to leave. But she did not turn back. Instead, she lifted her chin and spoke softly, her words trembling yet steady. She wanted only one thing: the piano. She asked not for charity, but for the chance to let her fingers speak. The room rippled with laughter, cruel and dismissive, yet she held her ground, her eyes fixed on the instrument that had once been her world. When the bargain was struck, 5 minutes, no more, she moved toward the piano with steps that carried both fragility and grace. The weight of every gaze pressed against her, but she no longer saw them. She saw her father's smile, her mother's laughter, the glow of evenings when music wrapped their home in tenderness. She sat, closed her eyes, and let the silence bloom into sound. The first note rose like a prayer, soft and healing, drifting through the air with the purity of dawn. Slowly the voices faded, replaced by the hush of wonder. Her hands, though worn, remembered everything. The touch of ivory keys, the discipline of years, the secret magic passed down through love. What had been dismissed as a plea for food became a performance that wove stories into sound. Pain, loss, hope, and resilience poured into every phrase, and the room surrendered to it. In that moment, time itself seemed to pause. The restaurant dissolved into a sanctuary, where strangers sat side by side and felt their hearts uncovered. Some wept without knowing why. Others closed their eyes, holding the music as if it might heal wounds they never dared to speak of. Even those who had mocked her now leaned forward, caught in the spell of something greater than pride or prejudice. When the last note lingered and fell away, the silence that followed was vast and shimmering. Then applause erupted, not hollow, not mocking, but true and rising from the deepest part of the human spirit. She opened her eyes to find faces transformed, eyes softened, mouths trembling with awe. For the first time in too long, she felt the weight of kindness reaching toward her. As she rose from the bench, a single thought carried her forward. Perhaps this was not the end of her story, but the beginning of something that could change everything. And as her gaze met his, the man whose presence had followed her unnoticed from the shadows of the restaurant, a stranger with eyes filled not with pity, but with wonder, something stirred between them, delicate yet undeniable. The night outside waited with its hush of silver, and destiny unfolded like a quiet promise. If this story has touched even a small corner of your heart, let its warmth linger. Let the music of her journey remind you that hope can be reborn in the unlikeliest places. If you wish to walk further with her, to discover how love and courage intertwine, let your presence be known through a kind comment, a gentle touch of subscription, a whisper of support that allows this healing melody to continue. For stories like hers live not only in the telling, but in the hearts that choose to carry them forward, one breath, one heartbeat, one note at a time. The morning after her unexpected performance carried with it the kind of fragile stillness that follows a storm. The city woke in soft shades of rose and pale gold, dew clinging to windowsills, the air tender and healing, as though it too had been changed by the night before. She walked through the streets with the same worn satchel pressed close to her chest, yet something within her had shifted. Where there had once been only hunger and exhaustion, there now lingered a quiet light, as though the music she had shared still echoed in her veins. People moved past her as they always did, wrapped in their own lives, yet she felt their eyes linger differently now. Some recognized her from the restaurant, whispering not in disdain but in awe, their gazes softened with admiration. A mother tugged her child closer and murmured something about angels. A young couple paused, watching her with hesitant smiles that spoke of respect. For the first time in too long, she did not feel invisible. She felt like a note carried by the wind, fragile but resonant, waiting to be caught by listening hearts. The satchel at her side rattled with the brittle edges of her father's old sheet music. She touched the papers through the fabric, the memory of his voice rising again, warm as sunlight. "Music is not in the notes, my little bird. but in the silence between them. That is where the healing begins. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the morning quiet seep into her soul. The streets no longer looked like battlegrounds of survival, but paths that might lead her somewhere worth belonging. She wandered without aim until the sound of footsteps slowed near her. A presence, steady and unhurried, fell in rhythm with her own. She did not look at first. She had learned to guard herself against strangers. Yet something about the silence between them, gentle, patient, drew her eyes upward. He was there, the man whose gaze had lingered in the restaurant, not with mockery, but with wonder. He walked beside her, as though they had known each other longer than a single night, his expression softened by something she could not name. He wore no arrogance, only an air of quiet strength, as though life had tested him too and left him carrying scars beneath the surface. When their eyes met, there was no pity in his, only recognition, like one melody finding its harmony. Their steps carried them together down narrow streets lined with flower boxes spilling crimson and gold. She spoke little, unsure if words could hold the weight of all she had lived. But he listened as though her silence itself was music. Each time she glanced at him, she found no judgment, only a reflection of her own resilience, as though he saw not the hunger, not the tattered clothes, but the fire that refused to die within her. They paused at a small park where the trees arched overhead like guardians of quiet secrets. Children's laughter drifted across the air, mingling with the fragrance of blossoms. She sat on a wooden bench, and he remained nearby, allowing her the space to choose whether his presence was welcome. She opened the satchel and drew out a crumpled page of music, the ink smudged by years of holding it close. Her fingers trembled as she smoothed it across her lap, and the faintest smile touched her lips, fragile but true. He leaned closer, not to intrude, but to honor the moment. "It's yours," his voice carried softly, a tone wrapped in warmth, steady like a healing balm. The words were simple, yet they felt like an offering, a reminder that her story was not only tragedy, but also possibility. She lifted her gaze, caught in the sincerity of his eyes, and something unspoken passed between them. It was not love yet, but the seed of something tender, something inevitable. Beneath the canopy of leaves, she felt as though her father's spirit lingered, whispering that music had always been meant to bring not just healing to her, but connection to others. And perhaps this was the beginning of that truth. As the day waned and the city lights began to bloom again, she rose from the bench with renewed steadiness. He walked beside her, not leading, not following, but moving in harmony with her steps. She did not know where the path would lead, whether toward another chance at music, or something far more intimate. But for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she would not have to walk alone. The streets stretched ahead like an unwritten score, and her heart, once silent, began to compose again. Every beat was softer, fuller, carrying with it both the ache of yesterday and the healing promise of tomorrow. Somewhere between the hush of the past and the shimmer of the future, a story was beginning to unfold, one of resilience, of courage, and perhaps, if destiny allowed, of love that could transform every wound into a song. And as she stepped forward into that evening, her spirit whispered gratitude to the unseen listeners of her journey, to those who might carry her melody with them, to those who believed in the quiet power of stories to heal. She offered her unspoken plea. Let this song live on, shared in hearts and voices, carried in comments and quiet blessings, in gentle touches of presence that keep her story alive. For in that sharing, the music would never fade. The following days unfolded with a tenderness she had never dared to imagine. Each morning brought a sky painted in new shades of possibility, and each evening closed with the gentle rhythm of footsteps shared side by side. The man who had stepped quietly into her story did not try to pull her into the glare of his world, nor did he demand confessions she was not ready to speak. He simply remained near, a steady presence that reminded her that life did not always have to be endured alone. His name, when he finally offered it, carried the softness of old music, Adrian. And when she whispered her own, he repeated it with reverence, as though the syllables were a secret melody he had been searching for. Adrian's world was very different from hers. His days were filled with order, with the demands of a family name that carried weight in the city, with expectations that had carved invisible cages around his choices. Yet with her, those cages seemed to lose their power. He found in her silence the freedom to breathe, in her resilience a mirror of strength he had forgotten he possessed. Where others bowed to his wealth or feared his authority, she treated him as nothing more and nothing less than a man. That simplicity healed something broken in him, even as her presence stirred feelings he could not suppress. They often found themselves in the park where they had first spoken, beneath the canopy of trees that listened without judgment. She would bring fragments of her father's old sheet music, worn edges trembling in her hands, and though there was no piano there, she traced the notes in the air with her fingers, her eyes closed, as if hearing the hidden symphony inside her mind. Adrian would watch in silence, captivated not by the imaginary music, but by the grace with which she carried it, her devotion, her vulnerability, her quiet fire. On one such afternoon, as the sun spilled honey through the branches, he noticed the way her shoulders slumped when she thought no one was looking. The strength she carried was immense, but it was built on fragile bones, and he longed to lift some of the burden. Without speaking, he offered his hand, open, steady, waiting. She hesitated, torn between the instinct to guard herself and the aching desire to accept. When her hand finally slid into his, the world seemed to exhale. Warmth spread through her chest, as though the simple gesture was a kind of healing in itself. From then on, their steps found a rhythm that felt almost like fate. He began to ask nothing, only to share. Stories of his childhood spilled gently from him, tales of gardens where he once played, of music lessons he had abandoned because duty had stolen his freedom. She listened, her eyes reflecting both empathy and wonder. For the first time, he confessed that his life of privilege often felt like a prison, gilded but unkind. In her presence, he discovered the courage to be imperfect, to be human. She too began to let fragments of her story surface. Late at night, when the world hushed and the streets grew tender with lamplight, she spoke of her father. She described the sound of his laughter filling their home, the way his music had wrapped around her childhood like a blanket of light. She told Adrian how grief had broken her mother, how the walls of her world had crumbled one by one until she found herself standing in the cold with nothing but a satchel of fading notes. Her voice trembled, but she did not turn away from him, and when her eyes grew wet with memory, his hand found hers again, steady and grounding. Adrian did not try to erase her pain with words. Instead, he let silence do its work, the kind of silence that heals rather than wounds. He knew that her story was not one to be solved, but to be honored. And in the honoring, something blossomed between them. Something fragile, yet undeniable, like the first bloom of spring after a long winter. One evening, as the city glimmered with scattered lights, Adrian led her to a quiet courtyard tucked behind stone walls, a place few knew. There, beneath a canopy of ivy, rested an old piano. It was not grand like those in concert halls, nor polished like the one in Bella Vista, but its keys carried the wear of countless songs. She froze, her breath catching, as though the instrument were a long-lost friend. Adrian smiled softly. "It hasn't been played in years," he admitted, his voice warm, almost shy. "I thought perhaps it might belong to you, even if only for a little while." She approached with reverence, her fingertips trembling above the keys. When the first note rose, it was as though the courtyard itself leaned closer to listen. The melody spilled into the night air, gentle and healing, weaving through the ivy and stone like threads of light. Adrian stood back, letting the music wash over him, yet his heart surged with something more than admiration. He felt as though her music was reaching for him, binding him to her in ways neither time nor circumstance could sever. The world around them disappeared into the song. She played with closed eyes, surrendering her soul to the instrument, pouring into each phrase not only her sorrow but her hope. And in that moment, Adrian knew with certainty that he was no longer an observer in her story. He was part of it, drawn by an unspoken promise that love, true love, was never about perfection, but about healing together. When the final note faded, silence filled the courtyard like a benediction. She opened her eyes to find him watching her, not as a man of wealth, not as someone burdened by family name, but as someone who had been undone by the simple truth of her existence. The distance between them vanished as naturally as breath, and when he reached for her hand once more, she did not hesitate. The city beyond the walls carried on, oblivious, but here in this quiet space, two lives had begun to entwine. The music still lingered in the air, and with it the certainty that this was only the beginning. She felt it in her pulse, in the warmth of his palm against hers, in the way the night seemed to cradle them both. Destiny was unfolding softly, tenderly, with every note, every glance, every heartbeat, leading them deeper into a love that would not only soothe their wounds, but also awaken a future worth fighting for. And as they walked out of the courtyard together, the path ahead seemed no longer uncertain, but luminous, as though each step was part of a symphony only they could hear. One written in silence, in trust, and in the healing power of love. Rain softened the city to a hush the next afternoon, a gentle veil that made everything look newly born. She and Adrian walked beneath his umbrella down streets that smelled of wet stone and blossoming lime trees, the rhythm of droplets steady as a heartbeat above them. The courtyard piano had become their secret, a place where time loosened its grip and the world remembered how to be kind. Each evening, as lamps blinked awake, she played, sometimes fragments of memory, sometimes melodies she stitched out of silence, and he stood nearby with his hands tucked into his coat, as if holding himself together against the sudden tenderness of being alive. The rain felt healing, like a blessing that asked nothing but presence. The days began to braid themselves into something that resembled belonging. She found small rituals she could trust, a cup of tea that warmed her palms at dawn, a clean sweater Adrian quietly purchased and left folded on a chair without comment, a book of poems he lent her with the corners pressed by constellations of dried clover. He did not smother her with rescue. He offered the dignity of choice, the kind of care that asked, "What would make you feel safe?" rather than, "What would make me feel useful?" When she faltered, he steadied. When she needed space, he became distance softened by understanding. In his quiet, she learned to breathe without bracing for loss. One evening, when the courtyards were strung with raindrops like tiny lanterns, an elderly woman paused at the iron gate and tilted her head toward the sound. Her white hair was pulled neatly at the nape, and her coat was the warm grey of a winter sea. She didn't speak right away, she simply listened, and the listening was so complete that it felt like a second instrument joining the song. When the last note thinned to air, the woman stepped forward with eyes that glowed gentle and bright. "I haven't heard anyone listen to a piano like that in years," she said softly, voice lined with kindness. "You don't play to be seen. You play as if the instrument was a person you love." The admiration was not the glittering sort the restaurant had thrown like confetti after the miracle of recognition. It was steady, precise, a praise that seemed to know the cost of devotion. The woman introduced herself as Mara Vass, a retired pianist who had once taught at the conservatory on the hill. The name carried weight in the city. Adrian's posture changed almost imperceptibly, a thread of surprise tugging at his composure. Mara asked if she could sit, and they settled together on the low stone wall near the piano. She didn't drown them in stories of stages or sponsors. She asked the questions that mattered. Who taught you to listen? What silence shaped your hands? When did music become the way you breathe? Her attention never strayed, and when the girl's voice trembled over a memory, Mara let the trembling be a bridge rather than a break. The courtyard felt sacred, made so by the kind of witness that heals. When the rain eased to mist, Mara brushed a palm over the piano lid. "This instrument needs care," she said, as if speaking to an old friend. "And you need a room that keeps the wind out." Her eyes rested on the girl's satchel, that weathered book of her life. "Would you come tomorrow to my studio? It's small, but the light is good, and I would like to hear you play without the cold crawling under your skin." They went. The studio was tucked beneath a row of leafy windows and smelled faintly of lemon oil and tea leaves. The piano there was a deep brown, its keys balanced like a held breath. Mara poured tea, handed them both chipped cups, and gestured toward the bench. "No performance," she said. "Only conversation, with wood and wire and memory." She played first, something simple and unabashedly human. Then she slid aside, and the girl let her fingers find the instrument's particular gravity. The first chord bloomed warm as sunlight. She played the lullaby her father once wove through winter evenings, the fragile piece she had stitched alone in a shelter, a new melody that bore the unmistakable footprints of hope. Mara did not interrupt. When the final note faded, she nodded once, eyes glistening not with sentiment, but with certainty. "You have the rare marriage," Mara said, "technique braided with truth, but the world will ask you to prove it in rooms designed to doubt. If you decide to walk back into those rooms, I'll stand at the door." Adrian listened, chest tight with a pride that frightened him with its depth. It was one thing to recognize her brilliance in the hush of a courtyard. It was another to have it named by a woman whose hands had once commanded symphonies. He wanted to believe that kindness could shield them. He also knew his surname could cast shadows, none of them invited. The shadows arrived on time. News travels through the chambers of wealth, the way whispers move through trees, swift, soft, relentless. By the week's end, Adrian's mother requested his presence at the family house, an estate too elegant to remember how to be tender. He went alone. The housekeeper led him down halls that smelled of polished stone and distance. His mother was waiting in the winter parlour, framed by portraits of relatives arranged like witnesses. Her smile was pretty and brittle. "Darling," she said, and the word faltered on the porcelain of her teeth. "You look well." He did not sit. "Mother, you've been busy." She stirred her tea, though there was nothing to dissolve. "Charity, I hear. Your friend from the restaurant has become a project?" "She has become a person I care about." "Care?" she echoed lightly, as if sampling a flavour that might be fashionable this season. "And does she care for what your life requires? The board meeting last Tuesday asked after you. The donors are shy about surprises. Investors do not enjoy unpredictability." "She isn't a headline," he said, "and neither am I." She set down the spoon. "You are a man whose name opens doors for hospitals and schools. Your manners belong to more than yourself." Her gaze softened, which somehow made the words sharper. "Kindness, yes. Discretion, certainly. Attachment, no." He almost laughed. It sounded like choking. "You would rather I hang ribbons of mercy on a girl I don't know than build a life with a woman I respect." "I would rather you remember what you owe," she said, and there was the truth, cool as stone. "Your father managed his tenderness in private and his alliances in public. We were all happier for his discipline." He left before his anger turned into something that might stain him. Outside, the garden kept winter's secrets under its hedges. He stood there long enough to gather the pieces of his resolve, then walked away from the life arranged for him like a place setting he'd never chosen. When he returned to the studio, they were there, the woman he loved without yet saying the word, and the teacher who had seen her. He told them the truth without embroidery. Mara's expression didn't flinch. The girl listened, eyes clear, breath steady. "I don't want you to burn bridges," she said, "but I won't allow you to build me a house from ashes." He smiled, something like pain and relief mingled. "Then we will build it from stone." Mara tapped the piano lid lightly. "Stone and sound." She looked at the girl. "There is a winter recital in 3 weeks. Small room, good acoustics, an audience that listens. Play there, not for newspapers, for the room itself. Let the city learn how to hear you in the right kind of silence." They prepared, not with the panic of scarcity or the frantic scramble for approval, but with devotion. Morning rehearsal steeped in breathwork and slow practice. Afternoons mending the old sheet music together with fresh copies Mara retrieved from her archive. Evenings when the girl's fingers trembled and Adrian set a cup of chamomile by the metronome, whispering nothing more than, "I'm here." It was healing to be needed without being asked to perform a rescue. It was healing to be loved without being perfect. On the second week, a complication slipped in quiet as a draft. Lyora, she of velvet invitations and silver laughter, arrived at the studio with a bouquet too white to be anything but a warning. She had once been the future everyone had agreed on, beautiful, educated, bred on the same cool air as Adrian's life. She kissed the air near his cheek and surveyed the room with a connoisseur's ease. Her gaze landed on the girl with a brightness that could mean kindness or ice. "So this is the music," Leora said, smile fine as a stitch. "We've all been waiting to hear it." Mara stepped forward, her presence like a lighthouse. "We've been waiting to listen." She gestured toward a chair. "Sit." Leora sat. The girl played, not to prove anything, but because music had always been the truest way she knew to inhabit a room when she felt unwelcome. The opening notes threaded the air, and the performance gathered its own weather: soft rain over garden walls, lantern light on dark water, a path through grief that did not erase sorrow, but taught it to dance slower. When the last tone dissolved, even Leora's posture had changed, the delicate armor of her cynicism softened by something that looked very much like humility. She stood. "You're very good," she said, genuine, glinting like a coin at the bottom of a fountain. "Perhaps too good for rooms that confuse applause with attention." She turned to Adrian, her voice low enough to be kind. "If you do this, do it with your whole name, or step out of it with your whole feet. Half measures are the cruelest." It was not the speech he had prepared to brace against, and so it slipped past his defenses and lodged where radical truths go to change a man. After she left, he leaned against the piano and watched the girl run a scale slowly, each note placed as if setting stones across a river. He knew which bank he wanted to stand on when the water rose. The week of the recital arrived with dawns that tasted of frost and oranges. The hall was intimate. 30 rows, a piano polished to a tender glow. The audience filed in wearing sweaters and quiet faces, strangers chosen by Mara for their capacity to listen without vanity. Adrian sat beside an empty seat, his mother's absence a presence all its own. Leora appeared on the far side of the room and lifted 2 fingers in a salute that felt almost like a blessing. On stage, a lamp threw a warm circle across the lid. The air thrummed with expectancy, but not the kind that devours, the kind that holds. When the girl walked to the bench, she did not shrink from the seeing. She bowed, simple as a breath. The first piece was a Bach prelude, each line braided with the next until order sounded like mercy. The second, a nocturne stitched from twilight and forgiveness. And then, at Mara's nod, came the one she had written in the shelter, the one she had played in the restaurant as a private prayer before it became a public miracle. The one she had retitled in the margin 2 nights ago with a hand that shook. Homecoming. It began spare, a question asked in the language of open intervals, 2 hands calling to each other across a distance that had once felt impossible. Slowly, courage joined, then tenderness, then the bright little sparks of joy that come uninvited and teach grief new steps. It did not pretend that winter had not been long. It offered spring not as triumph, but as covenant. As she played, the room adjusted its breathing to hers. Tears slipped without drama. Hands unclenched, heads bowed not in worship, but in relief. The music was not a show, it was a shelter. When the final chord blossomed and thinned, silence held, then folded, then gave them back to themselves. The applause rose gentle and full, and over it came a sound that startled her, a whistle sharp and wildly human from the back row. Mara, fingers in her teeth, like a girl in love with life. Laughter spilled across the room, healing and real. The girl stood, cheeks flushed, eyes bright as winter stars. Backstage, the hallway smelled of dust and flowers. Adrian was there, hands shaking. He hid them by pressing them to her shoulders. "You were—" He couldn't finish. Some words do not belong to language. She understood. Her forehead leaned to his chest, and they stood like that until the noise receded and the quiet knew their names. Then a cough, polite. A man in a charcoal suit, his tie loosened, his expression the hesitant humility of someone discovering he is late to important truth. He introduced himself as the director of the Hill Conservatory. Not the marble hall where reputation strutted, but the studio wing where practice meant love, where Mara had taught years before. "I came because Mara sent me a single sentence," he said, offering a card he seemed embarrassed to possess. She wrote, "I found a musician who makes the room kinder when she plays. That is the only kind we're hiring these days." He asked not for an application, but for a conversation. A room, a piano, an audition that is simply an afternoon with the door open, no donors, no cameras, only teachers who remember why we ever began. He nodded toward the stage. "If you want it." Her gaze flicked to Mara, who watched from down the corridor with a small, fierce smile. To Lyora, who leaned against the exit, arms folded, eyes bright with something like defiance aimed outward on their behalf. To Adrian, whose palms were still pressed as if keeping his heart from climbing out to kneel. She did not need to think. She had been deciding in the marrow all along. "I want it," she said. Later, after the flowers had been carried home in paper and the hall locked its evening, they walked with Mara to the corner cafe that never minded a late cup. They drank tea the colour of honey and told stories too small for newspapers and too big for fear. Mara's laugh landed like ribbons. Lyora stopped by the table, placed a small velvet box near the sugar, and winked. "Earplugs," she said dryly, "for the critics." Inside, cushioned in velvet, were two tiny pieces of moonstone, earrings shaped like commas, pause marks, reminders to breathe. Wear them when you need to keep the world at a tolerable volume. Outside, the night opened like a gate. They stood on the curb, and wind brushed her hair across her cheek. Adrian tucked it gently behind her ear with the careful reverence of a man learning to speak without words. The city did not disappear. It simply grew quieter around them, as if participating in their healing. They walked without map or hurry. He told her that the board could keep their money if it required his silence, that his mother would have to learn another definition of alliance, that he would rather fund a single piano in a warm room than 3 cold hospitals named after people who had forgotten how to be kind. She told him that she would not let music become the trick she performed for permission, that she wanted to teach in afternoons and play in evenings and spend mornings in kitchens where the kettles knew their names. That love, if it came, must make them softer rather than more important. They promised them not as grand vows, but as daily habits to be practiced like scales. At the corner where their ways parted, his street sloping toward duty, hers lifting toward the studio, they paused. The moment held them the way a good cadence does, refusing to resolve too quickly. He reached for her hand. She gave it, palm warm, pulse steady. They could have kissed, and perhaps some future would have insisted they should. Instead, they smiled with the irretrievable light of people who know what they've found will not break if it waits. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she echoed, the word soft and luminous. She turned toward the hill, the studio lamp already a star in her mind, and he stood for a breath longer, letting hope finish its sentence. Behind them, the city listened, rooftops and river and restless birds holding the bright thread of their beginning. Ahead, a door already stood ajar in a room that smelled of lemon oil and mercy. The next movement of their story waited there, not demanding, merely ready. And as they walked toward it from opposite sides of the same night, it felt as if the world exhaled and the road rose to meet them, healing, warm, sure. Morning spilled through the studio windows in a pale river, touching the piano lid like a blessing. She arrived early, breath clouding softly in the cool air, keys waiting with the patient poise of an unspoken promise. The card from the director of the Hill Conservatory lay tucked inside her satchel like a small, bright stone. Thin letters, steady hand, the invitation simple, almost old-fashioned. Come, let us hear what the room hears when you play. The words had slept near her heart through the night, and she woke to them as to a bell calling her to a place that might finally be a home. Mara brewed tea at the back table, the lemon scent curling into the room with a quiet that felt like safety. She didn't begin with advice. She set down the cups, slid the lid back, and lifted her eyebrows as if to say, "Your turn." They started with scales that breathed, with arpeggios that travelled not only up and down, but inward. Her fingers warmed the way dawn warms stone. Every now and then, Mara would touch one of her wrists with 2 fingers, a small reminder to loosen, to trust. Play less like a person proving something and more like someone remembering, she murmured. Memory is music's first instrument. By the time Adrian arrived, the light had shifted into gold. He carried a paper bag of bread still warm enough to steam and a jar of marmalade a friend swore tasted like well-kept secrets. He didn't cross the room with fanfare. He leaned his shoulder to the door jamb and watched her practice. There was a new steadiness in him, the kind born when a man has chosen his ground and decided to stay on it. When she paused, he lifted the bag, grin tilting. Fuel. They ate at the back table, elbows nearly touching, hands sticky with orange. She told him that overnight she'd dreamed of a room without chairs, where people stood because the music had taught them to. He told her that his mother had sent a white envelope sealed with a crest and disappointment. He had left it unopened on a windowsill and gone for a walk until the urge to read it dulled into the knowing that he didn't need to. Between bites, they planned the small, ordinary things: strings to purchase, the soft shoes she preferred for the pedal work, the ribbon she'd braid into her hair so stray strands wouldn't tickle her cheek mid-phrase. Ordinary plans are bridges. They carried them across the river of fear without saying its name. In the afternoons, Mara shaped the hours with the gentle strictness of a woman who understands that discipline is a form of devotion. She had her play the Bach prelude again, then asked her to sing the inner voices, not with her mouth, but with her hands. "There," she said, when a line brightened. "You've found the thread the piece has been asking for." They took the nocturne apart like a pocket watch and polished every gear. Sometimes Mara spoke. Sometimes she simply breathed along. When mistakes came, they were tended like skinned knees. No shame, only clean water, steady hands, a bandage that let air in. Evenings belonged to the courtyard. The old piano there had learned their hearts by now. It met her touch with gratitude. Some nights the rain made a roof of quiet sound, and she played beneath it while Adrian stood in the gate like a sentinel whose only battle was against the old inheritance of loneliness. Other nights neighbours leaned on windowsills to listen, faces lit by the lamps behind them, and afterwards sent down hand pies or the kind of applause that keeps its hands close to its chest so as not to startle the magic away. At the end of each hour, the world felt a fraction kinder than it had at the beginning. When the letter did get read, it found them on a Tuesday, late morning, the city bright and brittle with cold. He didn't bring it into the studio. He stood on the stoop, the seal already broken, eyes travelling the same line more than once. His mother's words weren't barbed, they were polished, each sentence an argument dressed as concern. Duty, optics, legacy, timing. The old lexicon of a life measured in photographs and pledges. He folded the paper with a care that meant he would not let it cut him. When he slipped inside, his jaw was set, but his gaze softened at the sight of her. She reached across the fall of light and laced their fingers. They didn't speak. Silence has languages too. Their hands found one that healed. The week before the open door audition, the city's gossip pages found their names. Not a scandal exactly. Someone had seen them walking. Someone had heard the courtyard. Someone had said her name with the wrong kind of interest. A photo ran, blurred by distance, softened by dusk. His head bowed to hers, as if listening to something only she could hear. The caption tried to be clever. The comments were a room with too many mirrors. Mara brought the paper into the studio, laid it on the floor, and set a teacup on it. Then she began practicing as if it were merely a scuffed tile. After 2 movements, the paper had rippled under the damp, and the weight, and looked more like trash than a threat. Leora arrived that afternoon, a wool coat chasing the cold from her shoulders, eyes bright with the news that she had declined an invitation to a charity gala with the simple explanation, "I'm busy listening to a piano." She perched on the edge of the practice chair and listened as the girl worked the storm out of a difficult passage. When the notes finally fell into the pattern they'd been refusing, Leora exhaled, the kind of breath you release when you realize you've been bracing. "You know," she said after a while, "I thought I would hate you. It's worse, perhaps. I respect you." The smile that followed was more than pretty. It was human. And I don't know if that makes any of this easier, but I think it makes the city marginally less small. The morning of the conservatory visit broke with air so clear it felt washed. The studio trio, student, mentor, man, met on the corner cafe steps and walked up the hill together. The building they approached was not the marble hall of donors, but an older wing that kept its warmth by remembering what it was for. Corridors held the scars of generations of practice, scuffs at elbow height, the faint scent of rosin and coffee, a staircase that creaked like a loyal dog. The director met them at the door in a sweater and a smile that had outlived a dozen administrations. "Tea?" he asked, as though that were the whole point of the invitation. The room was not a hall, but a studio with an honest piano and 2 windows that caught the winter sun. No panel, no rose. Just the director, a cellist whose name hung like a bell at the edge of memory, and Mara in the corner with her notebook closed. "An afternoon with the door open," the director said, gesturing. "We'll let the room decide how much audience it wants." She sat. Breathing found its tempo. She placed her hands not like a conqueror, but like a daughter returning to an old house. The first piece was Bach, not an announcement, but a greeting. The instrument responded with a tone like clear water. The door, left ajar as promised, gathered 3 more listeners within minutes. A girl with a violin case and a braid as serious as her frown, a maintenance man whose boots carried the honest music of work, a woman with ink-stained fingers who might have been a poet or a secretary or both. They stood against the frame as if stepping into sunlight. The director asked for nothing more than presence. Between pieces they spoke softly about the logic of a phrase, the courage of restraint, the way grief refuses to give you back your old hands, but will sometimes give you better ears. The cellist asked to try something odd, a nocturne with an improvised line beneath it, strings cradling piano like riverbed. They played. It worked. It felt like a new room opening inside the one they were in. In the middle of the afternoon, the old building remembered its age. A light somewhere hiccuped. A hum deepened. The ceiling fixture stirred, brightened, then went out with a sigh. The only remaining light came from the windows, winter-thin and tender. They waited for a fumble of switches, for the administrative rustle of solutions, but the director only tilted his head as if listening for a different current. He turned to her. "Play," he said, voice low. "Let us hear what sound does when it thinks it is alone." She did. The piano, released from glare, became a lamp. The notes were rounder without the ceiling's insistence. The room leaned in. In the dim you could hear the small things, the fingertip leaving ivory, the pedal returning like a heartbeat, the breath she took before the phrase that always reminded her of rain on a tin roof. A custodian paused in the hall, resting his mop against the wall to listen. Someone's phone flickered and then disappeared, as if ashamed to have tried to interrupt. When the electricity yawned and returned, it felt like the wrong kind of miracle. Their eyes were wider now. Light seemed unnecessary. The director rubbed his temples, smiling, and said, "Well then." He folded his hands, ancient as a chapel carved into oak. "I am less interested in whether you can pass an audition than in whether your playing makes time keep better promises." "It does." He opened a drawer, retrieved a plain envelope with the conservatory's letterhead, and set it on the music stand as if it were another score. "We would be honored to make a place for you, a scholarship for the small things. Tuition, yes, but also lessons in rooms that let the wind in on purpose, and time with teachers who know how to leave the door ajar." Her hands shook. She didn't open the envelope. She closed the fallboard slowly, one hand resting on the wood, and turned toward Adrian and Mara. Tears didn't fall. They rose, softly, like steam from a cup. Mara nodded, the simplest and most extravagant benediction. Adrian's eyes had gone dark with pride and relief. He held her gaze as if it were a bridge. In the doorway, the braid-sober violinist wiped her nose on her sleeve and looked embarrassed, and the maintenance man cleared his throat with gruff care, and the ink-fingered woman pressed her fingers together in the way of people who pray without telling anyone. Outside, the hill shed its frost in a slow glitter. They walked down through air that tasted faintly of metal and oranges, the envelope tucked in her satchel, but for once not the most important thing in it. On the steps of the cafe they sat, unwrapped sandwiches that dripped mustard onto their fingers, and laughed about nothing and everything. Leora, as if summoned by the scent of improbable joy, turned the corner with wool scarf and wind-flushed cheeks and a paper bag that clinked. "Flat lemonade," she announced, handing out bottles. "For toasts that don't need bubbles." They drank. The toast had no words. Some victories don't want speeches, they want breath. The city tried, of course, to make their quiet into noise. After the acceptance, a columnist wrote a piece whose headline was a question turned inside out. Can love tune a life back to key? The text tried to be generous and landed somewhere between curiosity and the old hungers. Adrian's mother called, her voice composed, her syllables porcelain. He answered with kindness that had edges. He would not choose between his name and his heart, so he chose to redefine both. The board fretted and then went quiet, as boards do when they realize a story is good for attendance. Leora sent a note to his mother with no return address and a single line: "Your son is doing something beautiful. It will not kill the family." Meanwhile, practice retained its modest holiness. The conservatory's studio was assigned, a room with a window that faced a maple and a radiator that believed in winter. On the first morning she had officially to herself, she placed the envelope on the sill and the old sheet music beside it. Past and future leaned in cordial to one another, and she, between them, adjusted the bench and began. Scales, yes, but also the unscored rituals of becoming, warming her wrists, listening to the way the hammer found the string, waiting until the day agreed to carry its share of the sound. The director kept his promise about leaving the door ajar. Some afternoons, a second-year pianist would drift in and sit on the floor, back against the wall, eyes closed. Once, a child wandered away from a tour group, clutching a program like a talisman, and stood as still as a snapped stem while she played, and left with his fist around a single fallen felt flake from under the piano, treasure enough. Mara came on Thursdays with a thermos and a notebook she still never opened. "Your tone has grown a window," she said one day. "People can see themselves in it without getting lost." Adrian built his own room of doors. He resigned from 2 boards. He stayed on one, the hospital that had once been an emblem, and offered a different ledger, a fund for instruments in pediatric wards, a corridor for art made by patients, a recital series where applause would be measured in eased breath. He learned to brew tea properly. He kept a small stack of quiet in his pocket for emergencies in which rooms forgot how to be kind. He made a list of the promises love had asked of him so far, and found every one had made him larger, not smaller. The first day she stayed so long her fingertips hummed. Even in sleep she dreamed of her mother, not as loss, but as a voice calling from another room, not frightened, not frantic, occupied. She woke with a pulse that felt less like ache and more like invitation. The next morning, after practice, she wrote a letter, not a plea, not a ledger, not a revision. A letter like a song without a chorus, words that knew their own limits and did not apologize for them. She mailed it without asking for a reply and walked home lightened, as if a corner of the world had been set down gently. Weeks unfurled. The city learned the routes of their days, the hill in the morning, the cafe steps at noon, the courtyard when the lamps blinked on, the small grocery where the clerks smiled as if they'd invented tenderness themselves. Winter softened at the edges. The maple outside the studio showed her a green so quiet she nearly missed it. She played a phrase of Chopin that felt like a window being opened 2 inches and thought, "Ah, spring speaks pianissimo first." The call arrived on an afternoon that smelled of dust and sudden rain. The conservatory director, a longer conversation this time, a hesitancy at the edge of his goodness. "We have a donor," he said, each syllable careful, as if stepping across a creek on stones that might do or might not. "A generous one, newly so. They've asked to sponsor a concert series, student-led, community-minded, free. With your permission, we would like you to open it. No press release. just a poster on bakeries and buses and church basements. And one more thing. They asked that the recital be held in the old market, the one with the arch and the skylights, and the way the world gathers there, whether it means to or not. She held the phone between shoulder and cheek, eyes on the maple. "Yes," she said. And then, after a breath that made space for the size of what she was promising herself to, "Yes." When she told Mara, the older woman squeezed her hand once and said, "Markets understand music better than halls. Both are good. Start where the roofs have already heard laughter and haggling." Truth likes company. Preparation changed its temperature, but not its essence. They shaped not a program, but a conversation with the city, Bach for spine. A folk song her father used to hum when mending a chair. The nocturne, yes, but with a surprise, 2 bars where the cellist would slip in under her like the riverbed again. A new piece she wrote in one sitting, small as a psalm, called Bread. Adrian designed simple handbills, cream paper, black letters, a line drawing of a piano under an archway, that Leora distributed with the efficiency of a rebellion. Children helped. So did a woman who sold herbs from a crate and said, "If you place it near the time, people with colds will read it. They need to." On the day, the market lived its usual morning, and then, like a person who remembers another life, it began to hush. Stalls closed early or not at all, vendors leaning on counters instead of packing crates. The air was an argument between bakeries and rain. She sat not on a stage, but on a rug. The piano rolled to an honest distance. The first note convinced pigeons to take the rafters. The second made a toddler drop a slice of apple and stare. The third fit itself between a brass scale and a crate of oranges, and made both look briefly holy. She did not play for approval. She played like someone passing warm bread from hand to hand, so no one went hungry, in the beautiful way. The city accepted. Old men who argued about newspapers stopped mid-sentence and nodded once, like men at the back of a church who know when to stand. Women who had come for cilantro stood with arms crossed and eyes watering as if the onions had followed them. But it was not onions. Teenagers pretended not to be listening, then remembered that pretense is a lonely kind of armor, and let it fall to their ankles. Midway through, she introduced something she hadn't told anyone she was bringing. A simple round, a melody that could be sung by people who believed they couldn't sing. She played it twice, then a third time, and lifted her hands. Voices tried it, tentative, then firmer, then braided. Her hands found the keys again, harmonizing, supporting, letting the market hear itself beautiful. The last repetition folded into laughter that had nothing to do with a joke. It was a release, a soft riot of relief. Healing, the kind you don't plan for and therefore trust. The concert ended the way bread ends, gone and present in the body. She stood, and the market did not roar. It sighed a wordless thank you. A woman at a stall held up a loaf and said, "Take." And a boy in a hoodie shoved his hands into his sleeves and muttered, "That was, yeah." Mara's cheeks were damp. The cellist's bow hand trembled the way hands do after holding too much tenderness at once and not dropping it. Adrian kissed her forehead in front of everyone, not as a claim, but as a gratitude, and the city, merciful for once, did not make a spectacle of it. When night came, they returned to the courtyard. The old piano wore the day like a shawl of stories. They didn't play. They sat on the stone wall and let their backs press to the warmth that lingers after a good performance. Leora arrived with bags under her eyes and a smile you could set a lantern in. "You made the market cry," she said. "Do you know how long it's been since anyone made the market cry without a fire?" A phone vibrated against stone. She glanced at the screen, breath catching. A number she knew from childhood without its label, a constellation of digits that had once turned every room into a kitchen. She stepped away 2 paces and answered. The voice on the other end was thinner than she remembered and stronger than she feared. They spoke like people crossing a bridge from opposite ends, one careful plank at a time. No apologies large enough to swallow the years, no promises too grand to keep. Only the soft agreements that make futures possible. "I'm in a program. I am trying. I want to hear you play, but not if it costs you anything you can't afford to give." "I have a market," she said, surprise and joy folding together. "And a courtyard. And soon a hall that leaves its door open." She closed her eyes, letting tears gather without falling. "We can choose a room that doesn't hurt." Her mother laughed then, a sound that had not forgotten how to be young. "A room that doesn't hurt," she repeated, and it became the start of a plan, not a poem, a date, a time, a place with windows. She returned to the stone wall, changed in a way only love close enough to be practical can change you. Adrian read it in her face before she spoke. Mara saw it in her gait. Leora took one look and began rooting in her bag for tissues, and, finding none, offered a napkin printed with tiny strawberries. They did not require the story. They believed the expression. They sat until the lamps switched themselves off, until the night itself remembered its duty and became thick with stars. When they finally rose, their steps were unhurried. At the gate, Adrian paused, hands in his pockets, the old uncertainty gone. "I bought a kettle," he said, as if revealing a secret that mattered more than money. "The kind that sings instead of shrieks." She smiled, the day settling into her bones like warmth after a long walk in cold air. "Then let's teach it our song." They turned toward the streets that had learned them, the city carrying their echo, not like gossip, but like blessing, and the path ahead gathered into a line so fine and sure it might have been written by moonlight. There would be halls that listened and some that didn't. There would be letters worth answering and envelopes that deserved to grow old on windowsills. There would be mornings where the music arrived late and nights when it would not stop pouring through, but there would be rooms that didn't hurt. There would be bread, there would be hands, and at the center of it all there would be a love not designed for display but for dwelling, a well of warmth the world could draw from without draining it. The kettle learned their mornings quickly. It sang in a gentle ribbon of sound as water trembled toward steam, its whistle less like a shriek than a bird calling dawn by its first name. He kept the cups warm on the sill. She measured tea leaves with the care of someone setting a tempo. They spoke softly, while the windows brightened, letting the simple choreography of steep and pour steady the world before the day began to ask anything from them. It was a small ritual, but small rituals have a way of becoming anchors. The room felt healed while the tea grew amber and the city's noises stitched themselves back into place outside. Her letter had found its answer in a voice she knew too well to misremember. There would be a meeting, a place with windows, a time written in ink that did not smudge, a room that would not hurt. The waiting was its own instrument. They tuned themselves to patience and did not play louder than necessary. Mara, with her practical tenderness, pressed an apple into her hand that morning and said only, "Eat when you can. The body likes to be invited to courage." They chose a cafe that held light like a promise. Tables small enough to keep people near, a fan that turned lazily above as if no one had ever asked it for haste, shelves of plants that leaned toward the windows as if studying the weather. She arrived early and sat where the wall met the corner, where the things behind her couldn't ask for attention. Adrian watched from across the street at first, giving her the privacy of a rival, then crossed when she lifted her hand. He held her knuckles under the table, a quiet compact that required no audience. Her mother came in wearing a coat that had learned a different winter than the one she remembered. The woman paused, found her daughter by the old map in her bones, then walked the distance like a hallway she had chosen not to fear. No dramatics. Only the slow mercy of people who have decided that telling the truth is kinder than pretending to be new. They sat. The kettle at the counter sang. The young barista wiped a ring of water from the wood, as if polishing a moment. She kept it simple. There was no ledger to read, no court to convene. There was a hand, small and capable, that lifted the mug and set it down without spilling. There were eyes that still looked for what the other needed rather than what the conversation might take. When her mother spoke, the words did not try to be heroic. She talked about nights that had learned to be quiet again, about a counselor who asked more questions than she knew there were answers for, about a program where the chairs faced a window and no one measured progress like a race. She did not say sorry, as if it could undo anything, but she said, "I am sorry," as if it could hold something and hold it well. "You don't owe me a performance," the girl said at last, voice steady as a pedal pressed in time. "Just your presence, and only as much as you can afford to give without breaking something we might need later." Her mother swallowed, bowed her head in a bare nod that was more beautiful for its lack of rush. "I can afford this," she said, reaching across the table not to clutch, but to rest fingertips within reach. It was the sort of touch you can draw back from without injuring anything. It was also, unmistakably, a beginning. They did not try to make up for every hour in one sitting. They let the kettle's second song close the meeting. Her mother stood first. "I want to hear you play," she said, the sentence warm with risk and invitation. "But I'll come to the kind of room you choose." The girl smiled, that small, fierce smile Adrian had learned to trust. "The market," she said, "or the courtyard. I don't need to do this for the halls." Her mother's answer was a sound that belonged to kitchens and good bread. Relief softened into gratitude. After she left, the world resumed like a record whose needle had found the groove again. The barista refilled a sugar bowl with the seriousness of a surgeon. A man in a suit read a headline and let his eyebrows announce his opinion. Adrian and the girl sat in the aftermath of mercy and breathed. They said little. Some days the body needs you to listen to it, learning ease. The conservatory, having flung its door open, did not suddenly turn into a carnival. There were still scales in the morning, and tired fingers by noon, and passages that refused to behave until evening forgave them. The director wandered in sometimes with 2 apples and 3 opinions. The cellist returned with a joke about the stubbornness of strings and a line he wanted to try under one of her new pieces. The violinist with the stern braid softened around them slowly, like wax remembering it had been poured to hold light. She asked questions in constellations, shy, then fearless. They began building something that had no name yet, not a foundation, not a charity, not a program designed with a logo before it had a heart. It started with one child from the market, a boy who brought a cracked ocarina and a stare like a dare. She showed him how to make 2 notes live beside each other without picking a fight. He stood taller. She wrote a number on a card and gave it to the woman who looked like maybe she had been his river when the world tried to be a drought. Word drifted, not rushed. There was a pianist who would listen first and teach second and never switch the order. Adrian found himself translated into this grammar without anyone needing him to pretend. He was not the patron or the press release. He was a man who went to the hardware store for rubber stoppers to steady a pedal on old wood, and who knew how to take a call from a landlord and end it with everyone on the line feeling less like enemies. He carried benches up 2 flights when the elevator sulked and made a calendar from butcher paper on which people could sign their names if they were ready to be brave in a room that didn't punish mistakes. Quietly, the room gathered itself around them, not as a shelter from the city, but as a hearth for it. In a world that liked its stories fierce and fast, theirs was not. It went at the tempo of breath, inhale courage, exhale fear. Still the old world knocked, dressed in invitations too polished to be harmless. A gala asked her to play on a stage that looked like a jewel box, as if placing her inside cared for her more than letting her out among the people who had heard her teach the market to sing. The committee offered a stipend and phrases that suggested that healing could be elegant if it learned how to stand closer to the right people. She read the letter aloud and set it between them on the kitchen table like a chess piece, deciding whether to move. "I can play anywhere," she said, "but I won't let them turn the room into a mirror." Adrian grinned at the accuracy. Lyora, who had arrived with a newspaper under one arm and a loaf under the other, broke the bread like the good friend she was and said, "Then propose a room with windows instead of chandeliers." They did. The gala declined, not rudely, just with the kind of regret that means we were hoping to be seen helping you in the kind of place that makes us look our best. She shrugged, a dancer's acceptance of gravity, and went back to practicing the nocturne which had learned to be more moon than sorrow in her hands. The first night her mother came to the courtyard, it was raining. Not hard, the kind of rain that makes the city careful, that asks flower pots to listen. They'd placed a tarp above the piano like an extra sky. She spotted her at the gate by the posture, shoulders no longer a cliff, mouth ready to say hello without flinching. The older woman stood at the edge for a while, as if making sure the room kept its part of the bargain. Then she came forward, sat on the low wall, and folded her hands the way people do when they are trying not to turn their hope into a demand. The girl did not announce anything. She simply began. Music that didn't pretend the past was different than it was. Music that nonetheless welcomed the future, as if it had washed its hands and come to the table ready to be decent. Midway through, she slipped in a melody with edges her mother would know, the tune of a children's rhyme her father had once altered to make her laugh when she'd skinned both knees on the same day. Her mother's breath caught, then steadied. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something more possible, recognition. When the last note finished adjusting the room, they did not rush. Her mother stood and went to the kettle. Adrian had brought it because he brought it everywhere now, as if an unassuming tool that sings at water could train buildings to be tender. The older woman poured, hands steady, then waited while they cooled their cups by blowing on them like children. "Thank you," she said, voice clear. The girl nodded. "Stay for one more." A permission that felt like a ribbon laid gently on a threshold. Shadow did not give up its claim without a hiss. The old house sent word, then a messenger, then a meeting request written on linen paper that smelled faintly of almonds and old money. Adrian went, because he would rather not turn into the kind of man who fights ghosts. He walked the halls as one might visit a school he had outgrown, grateful for what he had learned, surprised at the smallness of the desks. His mother sat in a room that could afford to be any temperature it wanted. It had chosen cool. She wore a silk scarf the color of rain clouds that have decided not to keep their promises. "I'm trying," she said without preface, which startled him more than a speech would have. "I am trying to understand a way of goodness that does not require spectacle." She looked tired and for the first time a little alive. "I practiced bringing a muffin to a neighbor without telling anyone I had done it." Her mouth twitched around the absurdity of confession. It seemed better than the gala. He felt something unclench. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. "I don't know if I can be the woman you need me to be," she continued, the honesty shaking a little in her hands, "but I can try to stop being the one I have been. That feels like a door I can hold open without pretending it is easy." He watched the light on the table and let his heart move at a pace that would not make it dizzy. "We don't have to do this fast," he said, "but we do have to do it true." Her breath came out in a sound he had never heard from her. Relief. She nodded once, as if acknowledging tempo markings she hadn't realized were always in the score. He left the house lighter, as if rooms could admit they were tired of performance and wished to learn another role. He took the long way back to the studio, down streets that had learned his stride. He found her on the bench, the window open, the maple outside flickering with the smallest green, like something considering being brave. She looked up, read his face as if it were a chorale, and smiled. There was no rush to tell. He set a cup beside the metronome and kissed her temple. "We have a little more room," he said softly. "That's enough for today." Practice turned to concert, turned to practice again. The way tides turn, not because anyone orders them to, but because they remember how. The market series grew like ivy, slow, sure, unruly in useful ways. Children who first came to stare began to sway, then to clap, then to hum, then to bring their own small sounds, harmonicas, pots and pans, a triangle rescued from a school closet. A man with paint on his forearms asked if he could set up a canvas during a performance, and did, catching the curve of her wrist in strokes that looked like wind. An older couple, who had once danced on floors that no longer existed, found their feet remembering steps they had not taught them in decades, and the market made space. She wrote a piece called Window, tiny and brave, 2 pages of music that felt like the act of cracking a pane on the first warm day. She tried it alone in the studio, then with the cellist, then with the stern violinist who had learned where to put her softness. It worked every time, but differently, like rain on different roofs. They carried Window to the courtyard, where it hung from the ivy like a lantern. They carried it to the market, where it lit faces without trying. On a whim, she carried it back to the restaurant where she had first asked a man for permission to play for food. Bella Vista had changed nothing. White cloths. Shining glasses. The old piano in the corner, dull with coats. The manager who had laughed had grown quieter. Time used its hands on everyone. She asked not for a free meal. She asked for the coats to be lifted and the lid to be opened, and for the room to prove it had learned to listen. He hesitated, then stepped aside, surprising himself. She played Window. Conversations faltered, and then fell into the right kind of hush. In the kitchen, a cook leaned against the metal shelf and closed his eyes. At one of the front tables, a woman who had been trying to tell her companion a difficult thing decided that perhaps it could wait until they were walking, where air could help with the words. When she finished, the room did not erupt. It felt something, and let the feeling ring. The manager cleared his throat as if about to apologize and couldn't yet, so he did the next truest thing. He brought an envelope with cash the staff had collected and put it down with both hands. She slid it back with a smile that said, "We're square," then tucked a card beneath the tip jar that had the market hours written on it and a note. "There's a room that won't hurt. Come if you need one." That evening, back in the courtyard, the air smelled of rain, thinking about happening. Adrian arrived with a bag from the hardware store and a grin he couldn't suppress. "I bought hooks," he said, showing her brass crescents that glinted in the lamplight. "For the mugs at the studio, so they don't have to fight for shelf space." She laughed, the sound threading itself into the old piano and making it look absurdly younger. They hung the hooks together while Mara told a story about a stagehand who had saved a whole performance with 3 nails and a stubbornness that refused to let the show fall to gravity. Later, when the last neighbor closed their window and the lamps softened their gold, the courtyard held them like a psalm. They sat hip to hip on the stone wall, the day's edges worn smooth. Silence settled without weight. He turned his face toward hers, and she met him halfway, the kiss simple and tender, a language learned slowly in rooms where hurry had never been a teacher. It tasted of tea and oranges and rain waiting its turn. When they parted, there was no declaration, only the proof of one. Breath shared and unbroken, foreheads resting together as if keeping a small shelter between them. The next morning, the kettle sang again. They let it. The city woke. Practice waited. The market dreamed of more songs. The studio hooks held their cups like tiny moons. Her mother would come to the courtyard next week, this time with a scarf she had knitted from Patience. His mother would write perhaps a note without an emblem on the flap. Leora planned a ridiculous poster with too much white space because silence is high fashion now. Mara would stand in a doorway and decide she had managed to teach one more student to trust the interval between notes. No miracles that crush, only those that keep. No headlines that devour, only names said gently. There would be mistakes, and they would be forgiven with work. There would be fatigue, and it would be met with soup and rest. There would be passages that would not yield, until one afternoon they did, and in that yielding the room would glow a little. And there would be love, not the blinding kind that burns a path through a life, but the steady kind that lays a path where there wasn't one and walks it, healing, warm, sure. Spring practiced its first sentences along the edges of the city, and the maple outside the conservatory wrote them down leaf by careful leaf. The studio windows learned to hold light longer each day. The radiator sighed less, and the kettles sang with a tone that felt rounder, less necessary, and therefore more precious. She played with the windows cracked open, and the street's ordinary choir folding itself into her phrases. Bicycle bells in the rests, a child's squeal under a lingering note, someone carrying the rhythm of footsteps past the door as if joining an ensemble without meaning to. The room felt alive in a new way, a body waking without being startled. The market series swelled like a tide you trust, bringing in people who had heard from someone who had heard from a bread seller that there was music where buying and selling paused to let something more important flow. Children began to map their week by it. An old man who had said for years that his hearing was gone found he could still catch the low notes if he put his palm on the wood of the piano, feeling sound the way trees feel thunder. The cellist started to arrive 10 minutes early just to stand in the archway and watch people become kinder without noticing they were doing it. Leora made flyers that looked like clean sheets hung in sunlight, and the city, astonished, behaved as if paper could be gentle. Letters came. Some were invitations disguised as compliments. Some were compliments disguised as invitations. One, plain and unpretending, came from a public radio station that still loved rooms with good microphones and better silences. A broadcast from the conservatory hall, it offered, student-led, community-minded, you at the heart and your friends around you, if you'll have us. It sounded like their language. The director, delighted, promised a hall with lamps, not chandeliers, ushers who smiled with their whole faces, doors left open until the very first note so the world could decide whether to join. They planned with the easy solemnity of people setting a table for more guests than they have chairs. Bach, yes, the prelude that had taught her how order can be merciful, the nocturne, but with the cello slipping under like riverbed. Bread, placed exactly where the market had taught her to put it, at the hinge between ache and relief. Window, a small lantern for the middle of the program, a round for the audience to sing, because microphones that catch strangers remembering they can sing are the most honest kind. Mara, who had once ghosted stages like a whisper of ferocity, would walk out to a second bench and let her four hands be the other hymn. On the day, the hall breathed with them. It was not a palace. It was a place that had learned to be a room without lying about its size. Ushers opened doors and left them ajar. People came the way rain comes, gathering, not marching. The front row held a tangle of familiar faces, the baker with flour on his sleeves, the boy with the ocarina now polishing a borrowed recorder with his shirt, the maintenance man from the hill who had followed the sound from a corridor and found himself in a story. In the middle row, surprisingly small in her elegant coat, sat Adrian's mother, the rain-cloud scarf traded for something the colour of early pears. Her hands were folded as if she were learning how to keep them from fidgeting with other people's destinies. Near the aisle, her mother tucked the ends of a knitted scarf into her lap and breathed as if every inhale and exhale were a decision she could keep making. Backstage was little more than a hallway and a kettle. The director had insisted. All miracles in his worldview deserve kettles. Steam curled. Mara placed a hand on the girl's shoulder and squeezed once. "You aren't about to go prove anything," she murmured. "You're about to go let the room keep a promise to itself." Adrian stood in the doorway, tie a touch crooked because he had learned he did not need to belong to the institutions his clothes had been designed to enter. He didn't speak. He fixed the ribbon in her hair, thumbs steady, and stepped back as if making space with the most important work a man could do. The first notes were a wide breath poured into wood. Bach braided its clean lines through the air, and time remembered its better manners. She could feel people settling, not into their seats, but into themselves. The nocturne found its place, not as sorrow, but as moonlight proving dark isn't empty. The cello came in where it always knew it would, and Leora, seated near the back, put 2 fingers to her lips as if hoping to hold a secret steady in her mouth until the moment passed. Bread did what it always did, taught nerves to unclench, reminded shoulders they could lower, told people that hunger can be answered without shame. Window came like a little door, opening inward more than outward, showing the room to itself from a new angle. Her hands knew their work, her heart knew its people. She looked up once and found her mother's face softened by a light that had nothing to do with the lamps, and she looked again and saw Adrian's mother staring at the floor, listening with her whole spine. In a different life, she might have called that victory. In this one, it was simply a good thing happening, which felt both less and more important. It wasn't until the small round, easiest melody in the world, designed to be shared the way children share secrets, that the old building remembered it was old. A tremor ran along the ceiling like a forgotten line in a story. Then the lights went out. Not a flicker, a full sigh. The audience gasped and then, taught well by the afternoon with the unplugged studio, hushed themselves. Somewhere in the hall, a phone screen blinked on and then off, as if apologizing for considering a rescue. The piano waited. The room breathed. She placed her hands again and played the round without any light, but the kind that comes from bodies deciding together not to undo what they've begun. Her voice rose, a thread, sure and unshowy, and found the pitch. One voice became 3, 3 became 10. The hall was a midnight kitchen, a campsite, a nursery humming the trouble back to sleep. People sang who would have sworn this morning that they couldn't. The ushers slipped to the doors and held them open just enough to let the hallway's blue emergency glow give the room the face it already wore. Not staged, real. When the power returned, it felt like a guest who had arrived late and didn't want to interrupt. The lights warmed back like eyelids remembering dawn. The mics hummed themselves into readiness. She did not stop until the round had completed its own circle. Then the hall and she and the radio and the people relaxed together, a shared laugh that didn't require sound to be heard. The director, off stage, leaned his head against the wall and closed his eyes like a man who had been granted proof of a thing he believed but had rarely seen, that the best rooms need us alive, not dazzled. After the broadcast, while the last applause was still folding itself away, the manager from Bella Vista appeared in the wings in a clean shirt too new for him, clutching a bouquet like an apology. He didn't find her first. He found Mara and stood with the bouquet held wrong. "If she'll ever want to play the old piano again, it's been tuned," he said, "and if she won't, that's good too." "I came to listen." Mara took the flowers and the message with the equanimity of a woman accustomed to shepherding both and said, "We'll let the room decide." She didn't see the manager yet. She saw instead 2 women standing 2 rows apart and not pretending they didn't want to be closer. Her mother, Adrian's mother. Something like a current of weather moved between them, shy, necessary, older than both. She crossed the stage, not to play another piece, but to shorten the distance. The crowd parted with the patience of people who understand that the music has not ended just because the piano is quiet. She reached them, and the 3 of them stood not as allegory, but as family trying. Words were small and did not overflow. A hand touched another hand. A nod carried the gravity of a city. The healing was not finished. It looked like it had started. In the days after, the broadcast lived in new rooms. Kitchen radios held it. A bus driver replayed the round on his brake and hummed it into his steering wheel. A nurse streamed it on her phone between beds, and one patient, almost asleep, whispered the low part because that was the only one his lungs could manage. The station sent a handwritten note addressed simply to "The Room That Doesn't Hurt," and inside it said, "You made us remember why we became people who keep microphones around." Lyora cried reading it, and had the decency to do it alone on a bench before composing herself into something the city could handle. The conservatory did not explode into offers, because that is not what conservatories do when they are being their better selves. It folded another chair into the studio because more children had begun to arrive with instruments that needed names. It offered the cellist a closet that did not smell like last century's dust. It learned that forms could be simpler than they had been, and that a poster on a bakery wall could be acceptable marketing. The director established a fund that did not boast, but filled itself like an artesian well from donors who sent envelopes with notes that said, "This is what I would have wanted when I was small." At home. Home, that word returning from myth to daily. She and Adrian set hooks in a second kitchen, because there was now a second kitchen. The apartment above the studio, unglamorous, with floors that creaked like gossip and windows that remembered more winters than they let on, had opened its door. They hung mugs like planets and taught the kettle the new song of a slightly different stove. The first night they slept there, the city ran past without asking anything. In the morning they lay quiet, as if not to wake a child, letting the pale stripe of sun find their hands where they were still linked. He had carried something small in his pocket for weeks, not because he believed in jewelry as justice, but because he had felt a circle forming and wanted something to hold it. Not a diamond. And a ring of brushed silver with a thin seam of gold, a circle that knew the value of a fault line healed. He did not kneel because there are postures that belong to other rooms. He placed the ring on the table between a chipped plate and a jar of marmalade and said, "If you ever wish to wear a promise, I would be honored to match it with my own." She moved the marmalade aside and slid the ring onto her finger without theatre. "We will wear a promise," she said, "but we will live it better." And he laughed, not because it was witty, but because it was true. She wrote in the afternoons now, after practice and before the kettles of evening. Music that had begun in scarcity learned to risk generosity. A piece called Threshold, built on the way rooms hold their breath and then let people in. A set of variations on the market round, each one threaded with the sound of a different stall: citrus, onions, thyme, flowers. A lullaby for grown people who had never been sung to gently enough when they were small. Mara, who had thought she might be finished with audiences, allowed herself to be coaxed into playing these things at twilight for cats and passers-by in the alley. Sometimes, to everyone's astonishment and no one's regret, they stayed. Her mother came to the studio one morning carrying a tin of something that smelled like a remembered holiday. She did not announce. She did not ask for a tour. She set the tin on the radiator and took the chair by the window as if she had known how to sit there always. The girl played scales to let the room get used to the new weather. "This place listens," her mother said, not looking at anyone. "The way your father listened when the soup was almost done." They did not rush into meaning. They ate the cookies when they had cooled. Her mother left with a flyer folded exactly in half, the market schedule tucked inside it like an extra promise. Adrian's mother sent books. This was the language she trusted not to betray her. Musician biographies with margins inked by former owners, a volume of poetry that had belonged to an aunt no one had remembered to eulogize, a slim guide to kettles through history that made them laugh until the kettle complained about being mocked. Sometimes a note. I heard the broadcast. It did not require me to pretend to be someone else. Thank you. When she finally came to the courtyard again, she brought a scarf she had knitted herself. The stitches were careful, and so was the apology that didn't name its crime, but took responsibility anyway by becoming warmth. The city had learned how to lift them without lifting them away. Almost. A glossy magazine called to ask if they could photograph the pianist who healed a hall in a dress on a rooftop at sunset. Leora answered the phone and said in a voice that gave no offense and offered no purchase, "She will be at the market with the people who found their voices under skylights." The call went soft at the edges and ended. The rooftop, spared, went on being a rooftop, and the sunset, spared, went on being no one's prop. They kept returning to Bella Vista, not because forgiveness required a loop, but because the room had changed and deserved to be witnessed. The manager learned to put the coats on a rack instead of the piano. The cook learned to come stand in the doorway and rest his hands on his apron when the music started. Once a couple celebrating an anniversary asked if they could give her a song to play, and she said without hesitation, no, and then gently, "But I'll play one you didn't know you needed." She played Homecoming with its margins mended, and they held hands the way you do when you thought you were finished learning how to be together and then find out you were wrong. One evening, after the market sang itself into quiet, and the courtyard exhaled, and the studio had finally fallen asleep, rain came with authority, the sort that erases plans. The river swelled itself nearly out of its bed. The city remembered its old anxieties. People hurried, then decided hurrying wouldn't help. The next morning they carried sandbags to the market doors. They lifted guitars to higher shelves. They moved the piano to a place where the floor had learned to keep its promises. Neighbors who had never needed each other learned a new grammar in an hour. She played between the carrying, not to soothe, there are days when soothing is an insult, but to braid bodies into a cadence that made work less cruel. When the water stopped at last at an inch below the threshold, as if persuaded and not forced, the market clapped at the river the way you clap at a stubborn child who finally decides their own nap was a good idea. The cellist leaned his head against a beam and laughed like a man who had found the long joke of life funny again. The boy with the recorder blew a victorious, awful note, and no one hushed him. Adrian's hands, muddy and beautiful, found her face and did not care about the mess they might leave. Other people saw and didn't turn it into a story with fangs. If they told it later, they told it the way the river would want it told, as water disappointed in its plans, as people who remembered that thresholds are sacred and worth defending. In the aftermath they slept for too long and woke feeling like a house at last, scuffed, warmed, ready. She wrote Threshold's last bars and showed them to Mara, who played them with a concentration usually reserved for telling a timid student that they were brave. Leora brought soup and broke crackers on the windowsill and announced that she had designed a poster for nothing in particular because joy deserves graphic design. He made tea. The kettle sang. Night softened the city's edges, and the maple outside learned the smell of rain rinsed out of a sky. In the studio, the last note of the day drifted up and held, then dissolved, the way good words do when you stop trying to make them be the end. They turned out the lamp. They didn't need to announce anything. The road ahead had become what they knew how to walk, a path that asked for hands and gave back room, a cadence set by breath, not by clocks. a love that kept its shape in the middle of work and weather and rows of folding chairs. If there was a miracle to be documented, it was simply this: that they had built and kept a life where the room didn't hurt, the music told the truth, and the people who came left with something in their chest that wasn't there when they arrived, the sound of a promise not yet finished, and all the gentleness required to keep it. Summer carried itself into the city like a hymn stretched wide across the sky, every morning arriving earlier, every evening reluctant to depart. The maple outside the studio had filled itself with green, dense enough to shade the window where she often paused between scales, watching the light sift through leaves as if the world had chosen to become an instrument of its own. The kettle sang lighter these days, less necessary for warmth and more for ritual, its voice a reminder that beginnings still mattered, even when days already gleamed bright. The market concerts had grown into something the city no longer called unusual. They became expected the way bread is expected, the way morning comes regardless of whether you've earned it. People arranged their errands around the music. Some brought chairs from their kitchens, others came with nothing but their ears, content to stand in the archway as if waiting for something they didn't need to name. And every time she touched the keys, the sound seemed to carry deeper into the bones of the place, as if stone and sky and human heart were conspiring to remember that healing could be ordinary. Children were the first to change. The boy with the recorder had learned to make more than one note now, and though his phrases stumbled like a foal on uncertain legs, there was joy in them. A girl brought a violin with a missing string, and Mara showed her how to coax a melody from what remained instead of mourning what was gone. Others joined with drums that were nothing more than overturned pots, but the rhythm they gave was true. Soon, what had started as her piano alone became a gathering of instruments unafraid of their flaws, voices that carried both hunger and hope, reminding everyone that music had never belonged only to the trained, but to anyone willing to listen and try. The conservatory had kept its promise too. Lessons now happened with doors open, and the sound of one room's courage often wandered down the hall into another. The stern violinist became softer in her bowing, the cellist began writing pieces for children instead of critics, and the director made tea for students who needed ears more than correction. The radio broadcast played late at night, and sometimes walking past apartments, Adrian would hear the round they had taught the hall being hummed while dishes were washed or beds prepared. The city had learned to keep a tune without being told to. Their apartment above the studio became a home stitched from small mercies, hooks that held mugs like tiny moons, windows that let in not just light, but laughter. A table always carrying bread, marmalade, or flowers left by neighbors who felt gratitude they couldn't quite phrase. At night, when the lamps were dim and the streets exhaled their last noise, they lay side by side, whispering not of grand futures, but of little tomorrows. Who would fetch lemons, whether the maple needed trimming, what new melody had arrived in her fingers that day? The ring on her hand glimmered not like a jewel, but like a circle drawn gently around everything they had promised to protect. Her mother came often now, sometimes with tins of cookies, sometimes only with her silence, but always with eyes that wanted to learn how to stay. Adrian's mother, too, had begun visiting, never grand, always cautious, but enough to show that lineage could bend toward tenderness when given space. Once, both mothers sat side by side at the market, scarves nearly touching, and the city, noticing, exhaled a sigh of relief, as though healing in one family made room for healing in many. One evening, after a concert where the audience had sung louder than the piano, she sat in the courtyard with Mara, Adrian, and Lyora. The lamps above flickered with moths. Someone had left bread still warm on the wall, and they tore it in quiet halves. "This," Mara said, looking around, "is how a school should sound." Lyora, mouthful of bread, grinned. "This is how a city should sound." And Adrian, resting his hand lightly on hers, whispered, "This is how love should sound." She smiled, because all of it was true. But what she felt most in that moment was not triumph. It was gratitude, the kind that heals because it asks for nothing, only acknowledges what has been given. Gratitude for the piano that had waited under coats until she was brave enough to claim it. Gratitude for the hands that had carried her through hunger and into hope. Gratitude for the people who had listened when the world had expected only silence. Gratitude for the music that kept reminding her that life, even broken, could be turned into something tender, luminous, whole. The night closed around them like a soft blanket, and the courtyard exhaled its own quiet hymn. Tomorrow would come with new work, new notes, new challenges. But for now, she let her head rest against Adrian's shoulder, let the warmth of friends and family circle her like light, and let the music in her heart keep its steady, healing rhythm. If this story has touched something within you, let its melody continue beyond this page. Share your thoughts in the comments, let your voice join the chorus, and if you wish for more journeys like this, stories of love, healing, and hope, remember to like, to subscribe, to keep walking with us. For in the act of listening, of staying, of believing, the music will never fade.